All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I think the audience here is sleepy a little bit. I hope via webcast they're a bit more awake, so I'm going to try one more time. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
All right. We're on now. Now we can get started. So a couple of quick housekeeping matters for anyone that is here, and for all of you that are via webcast. There's hundreds of people here. The washrooms are just down, just around the corner. Inside, you don't actually have to leave the room, and then to your left. A couple more things for you to be aware of. We're giving out Starbucks cards for participation. So for those of you that are here, you get them live. For the ones that are via webcast, you'll type your question. Theodora here or one of the colleagues will actually read the question for you, and then we'll send you the Starbucks cards via email. I may be wrong, but the word on the street was that Starbucks cards are a hit in this group. Is that true? All right. So my information was correct. So what do you get Starbucks cards for? Asking questions, giving opinions on or suggestions based on your experience. And we'll be going through some case scenarios here on things having gone wrong in the past. And I'm looking for from you about an idea of what you think went wrong, what could have been done to avoid the situation. So any feedback you have and any suggestions, anything along those lines will be helpful, and you're going to get Starbucks cards. You don't have to be right necessarily. All right, let's start with the first scenario. And this is, as the European Commission came together, one of the things that they actually did was prepare the documents in English or in French, and then translate to all the member countries' languages. This was actually a Czech translation, and it was an EU Commission Article 54, and it was about the wildlife movement. In the original text, it said all 4 conditions must be met. However, when the translation was done, it said one of the 4 conditions must be met. As you can imagine, being in private practice or in-house, you can appreciate that that is a huge difference, fulfilling all 4 conditions versus one of 4. Well, naturally, a lot of companies relied on that, whether they relied on it erroneously or whether they realized it was a mistake but said, hey, that's what it says, I'm going to run with it. And by the time it was actually changed back, there was a lot of reliance. The litigation is still continuing on it. We still don't know the full extent of damages, but it's in the tens of millions of euros already. So substantial damages for what seems a small translation mistake. What did you do differently to avoid a situation like this? If you're typically not in charge of translating legislation, but let's say it was a shareholder agreement or it was something on behalf of your, something that you're arranging as an issuer or whatever the context may be, and you had to get it translated. What did you do to avoid a situation of this nature? I'm going to start holding up Starbucks cards. All right, we have the first one here, please. And actually, sorry, I'm going to do one more thing in my housekeeping matters. For those of you who are here, I get to throw this, but in this case, I'm actually going to walk it over. And the Starbucks card's on top. So this is the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that the obvious answer is that one has to hire professional translation.
So in the event that you couldn't hear it, the answer was you should hire professional translators. And that's absolutely the case. You can't do translation of this nature and not get it done professionally. So certainly you want to do that. The other thing to keep in mind is that, let's presume the EU, and I would expect the European Commission to have hired professional translators. However, no one is perfect. If the professional translator missed it, and there was no second line of defense, as we like to call it, then you could have missed something as substantial as this. So the recommendation here is actually use revisers. So the revisers are the second set of eyes. So in professional translation, whenever you're arranging something to be translated, it should be translated by a professional translator and then revised by a second one. So always have 2 sets of eyes. These documents are too important, being seen by too many people to not have it reviewed that thoroughly. So that's something to keep in mind, and a recommendation that I would leave with you. You're always going to be safe having 2 sets of eyes as opposed to one. 2 people are always better than one. You do this internally. If it was in a law firm context, you're having associates perhaps do a first round of it. A senior partner will then review it. That happens a bit more organically, whereas here it's in a lot more structured fashion. All right. So as China started doing more and more business with the world, a lot of their legislation, especially when it came to trade and so on, had to start being translated in various languages. In this particular case, it was a Shanghai Maritime Court case, and they had translated some legislation where, let me just give two of the examples that happened there. Dry docking was mistranslated as tank washing. And except fuel used for domestic service, it was translated except fuel used for domestic flights. Now, I'm not a maritime law specialist, but I think dry docking and tank washing are substantially different. And if I was to rely on that, that certainly would be grounds to say, OK, this clearly is off. So I'm not going to tell you too much background just yet as to how this happened, because I'm looking for from you. Why do you think this happened? Is there anything you could have done to avoid a situation of this nature? Niels.
So, Gary, what we often do is we build in contractual stipulations that dictate which version of the contract governs in the event of a dispute. So if we have an English, in this case, a Chinese translation, the way we do business is we'd have a clause that says, in the event of a conflict between the two, we rely on the English translation or vice versa.
Absolutely. So, and that's, so to Niels's point, you have a clause that says English prevails in the event that there's a discrepancy between the two languages. So that is a recommendation I'll make to all of you. To the extent that you can get away with it, please do that, because it will help you. English is what you know and you can rely on. Except that some of these clients are now getting more and more sophisticated. And we've seen this a lot with foreign clients. So you'll have a Chinese client saying, listen, I'm paying a lot of money for your services. And I don't want the English to prevail because I'm relying on the Chinese to understand what's being said here. So I don't want that clause in there. So to the extent that you can put it, great. It's a great system of defense. But in the event that you cannot, you have to make sure this document is perfect. My recommendation to you is, even if you have that clause in there, make sure the document is as close to perfect as possible, regardless. But anyone else have any suggestions here before I give you some further background? Anything you could do differently? Chris?
Is it possible to have somebody who translates know something about maritime law?
Sorry.
What if the person who is translating or reviewing the translator's work knew something about maritime law and so was able to recognize that dry dock is not tank wash?
Exactly. So one of the key things, especially in a case like this, is have somebody that is a subject matter specialist. So as an example, if you actually had to put it into perspective, if you had somebody that didn't understand maritime law, they may say, OK, well, I know this term, and the intention of this term is X. There was something that was even a bit more complex here. So there was a mistrust in arranging these translations in China of having sent this abroad to being done by a foreign translation company, for example. So what likely happened was Chinese natives translating into English that learn English as a second language. The danger with that is that translators actually specialize into translating into their native language, the language they're most comfortable in and the most fluent in. Typically, no matter how much exposure people have to various languages, they'll have one language that is their primary language they're the most comfortable in, and that's what they should be translating in. So this may have been a result of them actually translating into English, whereas they were Chinese speakers. The right way to do it would have been you get a subject area specialist that understands Chinese very well, but English is their primary language, and then revised by another one that also English is their first language. So that would be the ideal scenario in a situation like this. Makes it a lot easier. You don't have to rely on them missing context or even awkwardly sounding sentences and phrases, which is typically what happens if somebody is not extremely fluent in a language. OK, so quizzes. I don't want you to get worried. This is not an exam. We're not testing you on the knowledge of what you learned so far. But I am looking for your opinion. HSBC, following the Nike model, to call it that, Nike said, just do it. HSBC said, what can we come up with that is like a catchphrase for our purposes? And assume nothing was intended to talk about wealth creation and growth in terms of investments. So assume nothing, because a lot of people made presumptions as to, well, if I only save this much, like they would just multiply by the number of years, versus calculating the true growth that happens through the markets. And this was, when they came up with Assume Nothing, they actually had focus groups. They spent a lot of time coming up with a structure as to what are we trying to say with this, how is this being conveyed in English, etc. Tons of people involved in coming up with Assume Nothing. It's sent to translation in an Excel sheet along with other documents without any background, like it was nothing, like it was a very small piece of content. So the translators, not having the full background, mistranslated which one of these. So I'm going to read them for you. A, assume everything. B, do not assume. C, do nothing. D, assuming is nothing. E, all of the above. So by show of hands, I'm going to ask now who picked what. And then when I give the final answer, if people are attending via webcast, they should just say, I had the right answer, so we keep track of it. So how many of you think it's A? By show of hands. How many of you think it's B? How many of you think it's C? How many of you think it's D? E? All right, final answer. Do we need a drum roll? No, we'll just do this. C, do nothing. So imagine being the CMO, that you have to now go to the CEO and say, listen, we need $10 million because we have a little mistake that we need to fix. And it's basically, we said, do nothing to our client base because of this mistranslation. Something seemingly simple, but that without the right background and so on, misunderstood by the translators. And here you go, do nothing. You have to now reprint everything to address all of this. So hopefully, who had C in the audience that doesn't have a Starbucks card yet? Chris, I know you have a Starbucks card. Oh, perfect. I know webcast is paying attention when they say I had this right and I want Starbucks cards. That's why we're doing it, webcast people. That's why we're doing it. No checking email while I'm presenting. So for the purposes of the cleanup, it's $10 million for a small, this is not typically the damage you encounter. And this may be one in a few examples. But even if the damage is much smaller, this is something that could easily have been avoided with saying, OK, here's the background that went into thinking into this in English. Let me give this to you, translators, so that when you're actually coming up with the equivalent version, you have the full background. OK, let's talk about some definitions. And the reason behind the definitions is we encounter these terms a lot, and they're often interchanged with each other, and it's not always correct. Translation refers to the translation of documents. So whenever you use the term translation, you're talking about written work. The moment you need somebody in person, let's say for a client meeting or a conference setting where you actually have investors from various countries, you need interpreters. Whenever it's oral translation, it's interpretation. Interpretation can be two kinds. Can be, sorry, I have a note and I need to, OK. So whenever there's interpretation, there's two kinds. There is consecutive and simultaneous. Consecutive is when you're actually speaking and then there's an interpreter that actually is doing it after you. So I'm going to give you a couple of situations of consecutive. Most of the time, if you're in court, in a discovery, that type of thing, that's the type you will see. And I'm going to bring up a Supreme Court of Canada case because we don't have a ton of litigation in Canada when it comes to translation interpretation. But this was a criminal case, R versus Tran. And I believe it was the 94 Supreme Court of Canada decision. And what happened here is, as Mr. Tran was giving his testimony, the interpreter was summarizing the testimony. So this is like watching those Chinese movies where you actually hear somebody speak for like 30 seconds and the subtitle says, no. And you're like, I know it was more than just no. Clearly, why didn't you just tell me everything else? So it was the same thing here. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, well, we cannot rely on the discretion of the interpreter. They may have meant it with the best of intentions, leaving out the fluff, but we cannot rely on them making these decisions. This should have been, we should know everything as it's being said, and let us sift through it and determine whether it's relevant or not. So this was sent back to the trial level. As you can imagine, a whole lot of expense for something that could have been avoided a lot easier. The simultaneous interpretation is what you would likely see, and I know the TSX does this. During PDAC, you see this a lot for all of you in mining. So you have people coming in from all over the world, and you have the people in the corner with the headsets on, and they're actually doing simultaneous interpretation. Simultaneous interpretation is a very different skill set because within fractions of a second, people are listening and interpreting everything that is being conveyed, similar to what you'd see in the UN, et cetera, as well. Very, very hard to do, and very few people can do it well. So make sure that if you ever need simultaneous, that you're actually asking for a simultaneous interpreter versus a consecutive interpreter. And just for anecdotal purposes, I'll give you one more interpretation gone wrong. This was a Florida case. And it was a gentleman that was a son of Cuban immigrants, Willie Ramirez. He was brought into the hospital. And basically the parents were, they thought he had food poisoning. And they were using the term intoxicado, which in Spanish could well be food poisoning. But the moment the doctors heard intoxicado, they thought it was, oh, here's another intoxicated teenager drunk, essentially. Treated him as if he was overserved in terms of alcohol. By the time they actually asked the proper questions about the symptoms and realized this was not what it was, this was a brain aneurysm, he was left quadriplegic. The settlement ended up being $71 million. And what aggravated it the most is that being a hospital in Florida, they did actually have interpreters in the hospital. They just never bothered to actually ask for the interpreter to come in and ask this. In typical ER fashion, they were moving quickly, didn't ask all those questions. So my advice to you, if you ever have a client that you're getting instructions from, or investor, whatever the context may be, make sure to ask them and say, are you comfortable enough to communicate in English? Are you understanding everything I'm saying? And if you get a sense of hesitation or something where you're not sure, it's always safer to bring in an interpreter and ask all the questions in that context. And then lastly on this slide, localization. So many of you are doing work all over the world. And you will see that although it may be the same language, there's variances of the language. I mean, we see it with English. Americans will use certain spelling for certain words that is different than ours. In some languages, that's even more substantial. So if you were comparing Quebecois French to France French, or say Spanish in Mexico versus Spain, there will be more substantial differences. So localization is specifically referring to you getting that content localized to a particular country and sometimes even a region within a country. And perspective there is important because if you want to be essentially catering to your customers as much as possible, you want to have it country specific. And to use China, for example, there's this deep misunderstanding with somehow that Chinese, the entire country speaks the same language. Whereas this is a massive country, big population that, frankly, until the 20th century, there were many languages in it. And simplified Chinese was an idea to have a language that was as commonly used amongst them as possible. But there are still major variations within the country. So whether it's Cantonese, Mandarin, but sometimes even smaller variations like Shanghainese, there's specific languages within China that are variations of Mandarin or Cantonese. And without scaring you in terms of the understanding it, the purpose of localization is so that you ask all the right questions. You think about who am I trying to target so that when you're actually arranging for translation, you're giving all the right feedback and you're making sure that the final product reflects the country you're trying to target. So what are some of the most common challenges in translation? What are some of the reasons that make you deal with translation pressures? Okay? So for all the issuers here, you have to, if you're distributing in Quebec, you typically are filing the, whether it's a prospectus and any of the securities documents, you're filing them in English, you're filing them in French. Typically, the translation remains an afterthought that you're dealing with everything in English, and it's like, oh, we have to arrange the translation. It's always being rushed. So that's why it's filing deadlines, limit time under the rules. In this case, it's the rules of civil procedure in the event that there's litigation. And rushed responses to RFPs. That happens a lot as well. But to give you context, when you're answering an RFP, and let's say you're submitting it to an entity in Latin America, and they want you to submit it in Spanish, you do great work. You prepare it in English, review it, get a very nice draft in English, and then you arrange it for translation. You say, I need this done tomorrow. Well, if it was a 50-page document, you probably need 8 translators to get it done in one day. So you get a very diluted quality because no matter how many revisers worked on it, because there were so many hands in the pot, you're not going to get the best quality. So the whole point with the rush is that if somebody's going to read the language, the version that they're going to read is the translated version, the same level of effort has to go into refining that translated version as you put into the English. Under the rules of civil procedure, for those of you that are lawyers, if somebody swears an affidavit in front of you, you actually need an interpreter to explain to them what the content of the affidavit if they don't speak English well. Otherwise, you cannot uphold it. You could, as an alternative, have a document that is translated for them to swear, but the problem is the moment they have questions on it, you're not going to be able to explain. So that's why it's always safer to actually have, basically have the interpreter there and address questions in person. Now, translation is not always the same. Depending on where you're filing it, what's required for it can vary quite a bit. So if you're filing something with Immigration Canada, they may have certain requirements. If you're filing some with the Securities Commission, there may be other requirements. So often if it's a filing with the Securities Commission, they may need a legal opinion on the translation, which is typically just a requirement with Securities Commissions. You wouldn't really find that anywhere else. But if it's Immigration Canada, they will say, we need an affidavit of translation, and we need a certified translator by CTTIC, which is the Council of Translators, Terminologists, and Interpreters of Canada. Now, again, not everyone is a lawyer, but for those of you that are lawyers, you also have, under the rules of professional conduct of the Law Society, you have an obligation to privacy to your clients. If you're in private practice, to multiple clients. If you're in-house, to your employer. Often what happens with translation, I cannot tell you how often this happens. You actually have it delegated to either juniors or support staff and says, okay, go find 3 providers, get 3 quotes, and go with the cheapest one, for example. So if you Google a company from, let's just say, India could be doing good SEO, and you're getting them come up. You get a quote from them. Maybe the cheapest quote you get. But before you know it, somebody working out of their apartment in Colombia could be working on your document that is very sensitive, and that if the information is leaked in advance, could be a potential cause for affecting the market, the stock, et cetera, well before a decision, before something becomes public. So because you have that duty of confidentiality to your clients, you need to do your due diligence in knowing where the translation provider is, where are the translators that they're using, how are they ensuring confidentiality, and can they ensure sufficient confidentiality for your purposes and the type of work you need. Now, how many of you within your organizations have received an email saying, does anyone speak X language? So most hands went up, and I see this a lot, especially when we do this for law firms, people circulating to their colleagues. In itself, there's nothing wrong with that, but I will warn you of a few things. Just because their colleague that speaks a language doesn't mean they're fluent enough in doing proper paperwork in that language or doing proper translation. So if you want to have a sense of what something says and your colleague helps you, this is what this email is about, for example, good enough. However, if you're going to use it for any formal purpose, you don't want that liability to remain with your colleagues. Hire professional translators, and don't put your colleagues in a difficult position where they're forced to do this. The part of the challenge as well is if they're not doing it for a living, although they may understand it well, they may not know how to exactly translate it. They may be too literal. They may not know how certain, especially, let me give you some context. You have a colleague whose parents moved from Germany. They were 8 when they came to Canada. Their extent of German is, colloquially what they've used at home. So certainly not the professional German that they would be using it at the offices. And as the language evolves, let's say your colleague is now 48. 40 years later from when they left Germany, that language is substantially different. So don't rely on your colleagues to do translation for something that they're not qualified for or that they're not actively doing. Now, it's also important to understand the level of experience required for translators to do proper work. To give you an example, if you're translating court decisions are very complex. They have references at the end. They have citations that need to actually be adjusted based on the translation. So if you actually had a marketing document and a court decision, the translators that should work on it are very, very different. Because not only, to give the example of the court decision, not only do you actually have to translate the content, you have to know how to adjust the citations in order for this to be used for formal purposes. So always ask what the purpose is for the translation. Understand what the qualifications of the translators are before you assign the work. You don't want to be in a situation where your marketing translator is doing complex legal work and vice versa. Understanding the translation process is also very important. So if you're actually arranging to get translations done professionally, you have one translator doing the first draft, a second one revising it. Then there's a formatter being involved, basically cleaning up the formatting. For those of you that deal with French often, you will know, for example, that French takes more room than English does. So do Latin-based languages in general. But let's say in French you take 10 to 20% more room. Well, this document is going to now need some cleaning up and formatting as well, just to get to the point where you need it to. And then the order of work. There's no point formatting a document if it's still being worked on. So you have to basically account for time for translator, reviser, then formatting before you can get it to the client. But often when you're actually saying, send this for translation, you're just thinking, well, it's 2 pages. I could just type that up in 5 minutes myself, or an hour myself. And it's never that simple because of all the rest of this process. OK. So I have some not-to-dos here that I want to leave you today with before I go into best practices. And if you have any to add, I have lots of Starbucks cards left, and I know Jaina has some in the back as well. And people via webcast, if you want to add to this list, and that'll make me very happy, because it's always good to know how to warn our colleagues from common mistakes. So first one, for all of you Google Translate lovers, do not use a machine translation, web translation for any formal purpose ever. I promise you it'll get you in trouble. Machine translation has gotten better. I don't think there's an argument there. But it often misses context, and it often will make mistakes with synonyms. So if you're using it for any formal purpose, there will be potential implications. Even if you want to know what a document says, what it will sometimes do is it will mix up context. So it may still make sense to you when it's translated into English, but in the wrong context. So it's always worth having it checked. So don't rely on machine translation. Do not use somebody to do the translation for you just because they speak the source or target language. So to my point earlier about your colleague that came here as an 8-year-old from Germany, just because they speak the language doesn't mean they're qualified as translators. Make sure you get it done professionally. And do not use translators that do not speak the particular localized dialect. So for anybody that understands French well, you know that Parisian translators will not produce translations that when you introduce it in Quebec, will not get any commentary being like, who did this? This was terrible. And the reason for it is because the language has evolved separately. And sometimes, so we'll see this in the translation industry where people will say, OK, where's the cheapest labor for French, for example? So they'll go to former French colonies in Africa, and they'll say, OK, let's get it done there. We'll get your prospectus down there and file it with the Securities Commission for Quebec. I promise you, the moment somebody reads that, within a couple of paragraphs, there will be comments. So make sure your translators speak the localized dialect. They're based out of the countries that you're actually doing this work for. Do not use translators that are not subject area specialists. So to some of the examples that we mentioned earlier, we had the maritime court case, for example. If they didn't understand maritime law, they would have a hard time doing the translation properly, no matter how much research they did, because they could look up specific terms, but they may not have full context in it. Do not rush the translation of documents. Proper research is critical. And the reason for this is, although you may be a subject area specialist, you don't always have the background on every organization you're working with. So in order to actually get the full understanding, you're actually doing research on the respective organizations. If you are rushing this process, then the translators are going to do their best, but they're not going to get as granular when it comes to actually research specific on organizations, on particular deals, etc. Anybody else that wants to add a not to do? Ah, perfect. Yeah. I'm going to bring the microphone and the Starbucks card at the same time. As a reminder to the people via webcast, you can always do this. Thank you. And your name, please?
Jean-François.
Jean-François, perfect.
Do not think 1,500 words can be translated in an hour or 20 minutes, or So give us time.
Jean-François is tired. I don't know if you're. We'll chat afterwards, but no. Specifically to that point, 1,500 words. If the document is technical, it'll actually take professional translators a day to do 1,500 words for a technical document. So when you have those 2-3 pages I was mentioning earlier, if they're dense and you have 500 pages, 500 words a page, and you have 3 pages, you're like, it's just 3 pages. How long could it take? Well, if it's heavy and technical, it could take a translator up to 8 hours to do it. So to Jean-François' point, that's exactly the part of the reason why this happens. Anybody else? Please. I like this. Please.
Okay, thank you. I'm Giselle. And
Thank you,
I think,
Giselle.
Yes, do not stick to the rule that we have to translate word by word. It's more on the context, the overall being meaningful and understandable.
Absolutely. So to Giselle's point, translation should not just be literal, because that's part of the problem with machine translation is that it gives you literal translation. You are actually adapting the context in this other language. So it's not about every word being translated in that context. It's how can I convey the same meaning in this other language. And some words don't have, there will be some examples we'll be talking about earlier, some languages do not have exact translations for certain words. So the whole point of good translators is to know how to convey that meaning without it being word for word necessarily. And I love all the hands going up. I'm going to add one more thing just before I do this piece. So when you see a translation that seems a little too literal, not to generalize, but it's typically a context of the translator wasn't necessarily understanding the subject area very well. So they translated literally in order not to take too many risks about missing into context. So that's your warning sign if you see that happening. And then we have Stephanie next, because she had her hand up first.
I have a question.
Oh, perfect, even better.
So,
Do you need this?
Yes, please.
okay. I have one. It's okay.
Oh,
Save
perfect.
it. My question is, how do you translate expressions? Right? Like an expression in the English language will not make sense if you translate into, let's say, Italian or really any other language,
Right.
or even metaphors.
Yes.
Right?
So-
And sometimes in litigation, you find it in narratives or in transcripts, and it makes sense in the English language. Or sometimes I've actually seen it where I think it was in Italian, and I'm like, this is not an English expression. So how do you deal with that?
So I may have to skip a few slides because you guys are asking all the right questions, and now I'm actually getting ahead in the presentation. But to that point, one of the pieces of advice I have is try to avoid figures of speech and so on when you're actually getting a document translated. But good translators know how to get around it. So with the example, break a leg, and you translate it into Chinese or Italian, and you translate that literally, you're going to offend some people. So good translators know and to say, okay, good luck. They're not going to translate as break a leg and then send it to the client, and the client is like, I'm not sure we should be doing business with people. They believe in mutilation of sorts, which they're lost in translation as we have the title today, could easily happen from something as simple as that if translators don't do it properly.
So would you have to put a caveat, though, to say, the literal translation is such and such, however, this means good luck?
Yeah, I think you wouldn't even have to do that. If it's in professional translation, they will actually make those adaptations. If it is a text where you're actually trying to break it apart for the purpose of litigation, then you can add some of that background. But you would ask the translator specifically, here's what we're looking for. Were there mistakes where it was translated literally, which would have not made sense in this context, etc. But typically, if you're just saying, here's this agreement, get it translated, professional translators don't need to put the caveats. They'll do the adaptation specifically to convey the meaning without translating it break a leg, because that doesn't make sense, right? So that's, and then Ramiro here, let me just get the microphone moving. And this microphone is supposed to be thrown around, so I'm going to actually test this up.
Awesome. I guess mine is more of a do, but expect. Expect that there will be difference of opinions, meaning there's a difference between a translation and a preference.
Right.
And I think that comes across a lot. So do not expect that people will not have an opinion on this.
Absolutely. So, and thank you. We're testing my caching abilities. So to Ramiro's point, that will happen a lot. You give a document to 10 different translators, you're never going to get 10 equal translations back. Those documents will never look identical because there is styles and there's opinions. So when you're arranging things for translation, make sure those translators are professional. But you don't have to be nitpicky about, well, this is what I would have said, and because as long as that makes sense, then to some extent you have to pick your battles. But if you're going to prepare a lot of marketing materials and so on, and you actually want a certain context always being given, Figure out a team that will always conveys the style you want and remain consistent, because they will really get to know you, get to know your style, and really reflect that going forward. But I actually have, I'm touching base on that point momentarily, but like I said, you're making my life a lot easier. Any questions from the people online? You know you get Starbucks cards too, right? So on what not to do, a couple more things to be aware of. I cannot tell you how often this happens when you get version 26 of a prospectus, and version control becomes such a pain. So my advice to you is, I know sometimes you have no choice. You actually have to do various versions of a document. But when you're sending it for translation, don't send every single version through. Send it every so often, so that the translators don't have to go through the same version control issue. If you had all 26 versions and you are now managing translator, reviser, formatter, there's more room to mix up potential versions. So try to not send multiple versions whenever you can avoid it. Ideally, send a finalized document and don't send any updates. I know that's hard for some of you, but try to do that. When dealing with marketing materials, the DTP, desktop publishing work piece, is very critical if the person doing the design work doesn't understand the language. So there was a law firm in downtown Toronto, and they were actually going to do work. They were going for a trade show in Japan and Korea, meeting with some, China and Japan. And they were actually meeting with some clients in both places. They said to us, can you arrange this translation? Our formatters will do it, and then we'll send it out for print. And we said, that's fine, but if we're not doing the formatting, do your translators understand Chinese or Japanese? They said no. And we said, if we're signing off on it, we need to see it after they do the desktop publishing work. They were not particularly happy with us because the timing was a little tight, but we insisted on it. So we get the Chinese document back. Almost perfect, just one period missing, nothing that would have been problematic. Then we get the Japanese document back. And there's right on the first page, there's an entire paragraph left in Chinese. So you get, you're saying you're a leading firm in your respective area, and yet there's an entire paragraph left in Chinese in the Japanese document. Now, the Japanese culture strives for perfection. The last thing they want to see is a Chinese paragraph left in the document to them. So they ultimately appreciated that we insisted on reviewing it. My word of advice to you is, if you have internal designers, formatters, make sure that they understand the language. If they don't, get your provider to do the desktop publishing work as well. Make sure you don't run into those issues. And this could be as simple as with French. The accents and so on that you actually see everywhere matter, and matter a lot. So you want to make sure that those are not missed in the process.
Sorry.
Please,
Jean-François. When you're referring to formatter, are you referring to like proofreader?
No. So this is translation revision, and then the formatter or designer. So let's say it was a desktop publishing file. It's something, an InDesign file. So this is something that you're printing for formal purposes, and it needs to now be put into this format, where after the translator and reviser have gone through it, you still have to input it there.
Okay.
But if they didn't understand the language, which is what happened incidentally with Chinese and Japanese, because a lot of the characters are the same, so you can't really blame the designer. They thought they probably moved that paragraph, and they did not. Mm-hmm. But they left it in Chinese. To somebody that understands the language, it would be like, yep, this is not Japanese. Okay. And that would have been enough to trigger that.
In the process, is there also a proofreader that would verify all numbers, all italics, all everything? So the numbers.
Exactly.
So that's the formatter, right?
So after the formatter, then the reviser that revised the content originally reviews it again to make sure that is done. Okay. So that's, in professional translation, that's how you would do it. Okay. Especially, and again, to use an example of prospectus, because the numbers matter a lot, and this is your disclosure to your investor base, they need to be transparent, and a zero can matter a lot, or where a comma goes matters a lot. And as you know, in French, for example, where we use periods, there will be commas, vice versa, or there will be space instead of commas. All those things matter, and even good translators know that they have to make those adjustments as well. Whereby it's not translation; you're just changing the format of the numbers, but that matters in how that is conveyed in a particular country, in a culture. Is the dollar sign before or after? Is there a space between the dollar sign and the number? All those things matter, and that's why it's important to have professional translators. To that point, do not submit translated documents that have not been reviewed. For that very reason we just talked about, there's a lot that can be missed. The second set of eyes is very important. And do not make translation decisions exclusively on costs. To my example earlier about somebody working out of their apartment in Colombia in their pajamas that you have no control over whatsoever because you didn't do the due diligence where the work was being done. Don't make it exclusively on costs. Ask these additional questions to know that you're getting that quality and the reliability of confidentiality. All right, quiz number 2, my favorite quiz. We have a third one afterwards, but this is my favorite. And a major opportunity to win Starbucks cards. President Jimmy Carter in '77 shows up in Poland, has a speech for in front of the Polish people, and makes which one of these mistakes during the course of his speech? A, are you from Poland? Then President Jimmy Carter wants to sleep with you. B, Carter desires the Poles. C, he was happy to grasp at Poland's private parts. D, he has abandoned America forever. And E, all of the above. I apologize to anyone walking by that didn't know the context of what we're talking about, because it may sound a little vulgar. But I'm going to start by show of hands. How many of you think it's A? How many of you think it's B? How many think it's C? How many think it's D? How many think it's E? Final answer, E. All of the above. No wonder it took another 12 years for the Berlin Wall to fall, when they thought you actually have the President of the United States making this many mistakes during the course of their speech. And this actually made it Time Magazine's top 10 most embarrassing diplomatic moments of all time. And they were going back as far as we had written history to the Romans and the Egyptians, and this was still top 10. Reason why this happened? So the interpreter that the president had was Stephen Seymour. When I hear Stephen Seymour, it doesn't really sound very Polish to me, and it was accurate. He learned like a good old American college boy. He learned it largely in college in the U.S. Didn't have that in first-hand exposure. Obviously, the U.S. authorities had the concern about could this interpreter be potentially a spy, somebody that could say the wrong things to the audience there, potentially get the U.S. in trouble, etc. So they wanted to play it safe. But I don't think this is how you want to play it safe when you're arranging for this thing. So, the making all of the above. So we'll see how many were right online.
We have 2 right, but out of 5 in.
2, all right, perfect. So I told you a bit about what not to do, and without scaring you now, what are some of the things you should do? What are some of the best practices, things that will make you better and will ensure that you're getting quality in what you're arranging for translation? So use a provider that will dedicate a consistent team of translators and revisers for you. So the reason for that is, much like what I mentioned earlier, they get to know your style and get to know your preferences. Whether it's ongoing work for your filing requirements, whether it's an ongoing piece of litigation, no matter what it is, marketing materials, fund facts, whatever it is that you're providing to your client base or investors, you want that spirit to be consistent, that style to be consistent. You should make sure that they are subject area specialists. So whoever is doing your securities documents versus your internal policies or marketing documents, they should be subject area specialists. Make sure that if there is a certification required, you're telling the translation provider right from the get-go, here's what I need. I need a certificate of translation. I need an affidavit. I need to file it with a foreign consulate. All those things are important pieces of information. Now, there may be instances where an unscrupulous party gives you a translation that is erroneous, whether it's by mistake or whether it's on purpose. There was a case, a litigation case involving Samsung, actually, and one of the patent translation that was submitted had conveniently avoided a certain part of it that was helping Samsung, but the other party that arranged it had left it out. Now, the judge didn't want to infer whether that actually was done on purpose or not. The judge said, if you're going to give me the translation incomplete, I'm going to throw out the entire thing. So to that point, if you're arranging something for a translation or another party is giving it to you, you haven't really worked with this party, you don't fully trust them, you don't have to go retranslate it yourself, but certainly have the translation checked. Make sure that the translation is accurate. The first thing you should do is get that opinion. Now, once you get that opinion, you will have 3 potential outcomes. One is, it's perfect, don't do anything to it. Second one is not quite perfect, but we can clean it up and give you a refined version. And the third one is you don't want to be using this. It's terrible and it's misleading. And that's when you should tell the other party, this is terrible and misleading. I'm arranging for another translation. Here's the qualifications of the people I'm doing, and we're using my version. Okay? Make sure that the provider is using translation memory and terminology databases. What are these things for those of you that don't deal with translation as often? These are essentially tools that translators use to make sure that the terms that you are using remain consistent throughout the course of the work with you. So they're essentially creating these mini glossaries that are specific to you and that your organization now remains specific in this context. And to the point about desktop publishing that we mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that to the extent that your internal designers, or if you don't have internal designers, your provider does all the desktop publishing work. So there's no room for them messing up the order, especially in a language they don't understand. And especially, desktop publishing can get even more complex when you're dealing with languages like Arabic, for example. It's right to left. Unless you've dealt with that language before, you're not really knowing how to handle it properly. You should make sure that your provider has one contact point for your purposes, no matter what the situation is. The reason why I say this is when we talked about the order of translation, you have translators, revisers, formatters, and sometimes, depending on how quickly it's being done, even multiple translators on the first draft. What does that really mean for you is you don't want to be dealing with 5 different people and you managing them. So you should make sure your provider has one contact point, and this contact point is the project manager that is in charge of managing the entire process for you. You're not getting to deal with every individual. You assign it, they quarterback the process, give you a final product. Make sure that you have a trusted provider with NDAs, all the confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements in place. The reason for it is, again, to that person working out of their apartment in Colombia, I'm picking on the apartments in Colombia, but you want to make sure that you can uphold these confidentiality agreements if need be. Make sure that the translated content is culturally sensitive. So if you're inviting a delegation from Saudi Arabia to come and visit here, don't invite them to a wine tasting afterwards. They may not appreciate the inference to alcohol if they are a delegation from Saudi Arabia. So you want to make sure it's culturally sensitive. Use insured providers. Okay? I cannot emphasize this enough. It's 3 words, but it has its own line. The reason for it is you want this liability to remain with your translation provider. If they don't have their own errors and omissions insurance, that something went wrong, you could sue them. If they're a small provider, there isn't really much you're going to get out of it. So you want to make sure they have their own errors and omissions insurance, and that liability is passed on to them. Wherever possible, try to pass on documents in an editable format. So PowerPoint, Microsoft Word, Excel versus PDFs. Feel free to send a PDF along with it as well, but it's much faster to work out of editable documents versus PDFs. And when you are preparing documents knowing that they will actually require translation, factor that in the process. Factor in that a certain amount of time has to go into it. If you're not sure how much time should be allotted for it, call your provider, ask them. No matter what situation you're dealing with, chances are they've seen it before. So ask for their opinion. How much time should I factor in for this? What's the best way to handle it, etc. When you rush documents, you're getting multiple translators on the first draft. And that's something we really discourage you to do, because no matter how good the translators are, the moment you have multiple of them on the first draft, and no matter how good the revisers are, it'll be hard to refine it to ensure a consistent style along the entire document. Jargon, idioms, figures of speech, to the question that Stephanie had earlier, try to avoid them. However, good translators are going to know how to work around them and make it easier for your team. Be careful in using acronyms that may not translate well into another language. So if you are going to give an acronym, put in brackets what it stands for so that there is no room for misunderstanding. There's acronyms for everything these days. So just research alone may not be sufficient to get the right acronym. So if you give it in brackets, it makes it a lot easier for translators what it stands for. In terms of understanding the cultural perspective, you're doing work all over the world. Part of the reason why you're doing translation, because it's not just for French, you're doing it in many other languages. You need to understand that various countries have different legal systems, for example, or governmental systems than what we do in Canada. So you shouldn't refer, for example, to their respective Supreme Court, because that country may not even have a Supreme Court. we talked about earlier what happens, when there isn't a particular word that has a translation in that language. Talk about certain languages. So Indonesian, for example, you do not have tenses, okay? Everything is present tense, and you have other words that dictate when something happened. So say, yesterday I go to market, today I go to market, tomorrow I go to market. So it's the yesterday and the tomorrow that's reflecting happened in the past, happened in the future. Good translators need, work around the complex tenses as we have them in English or in other languages to work around the variations. Before you're doing business with another country, invest some time in understanding their culture and how they actually operate when it comes to doing business. So in Brazil, for example, they may not want to do a deal with you first time you meet them. They may want to meet you 5-6 times before they're even willing to talk business. So these are important things for you to understand. And even in the approach when you're doing documents, you're actually reflecting that versus saying, OK, last slide, what's the decision? It may put some pressure on a relationship that is still in the early stages. Now, my favorite part. How many of you remember Ford Pinto? Yeah? Bit of an older car. Maybe I'm dating myself a little bit. But I'm going to pick on Ramiro. Ramiro, what does Pinto mean in certain countries in Latin America?
It can be something quite, embarrassing for a male.
Actually, sorry, I forgot to. So the question was, what does Pinto mean in certain countries in Latin America?
It can be somewhat embarrassing for a male. It depicts a small size of a particular piece of...
So without putting Ramiro in a difficult position, I'm going to be the vulgar one, and it means little penis. And, they were wondering why the sales didn't do well amongst men or women, and then they couldn't explain why. No one wanted to get a car that said, this is your little penis car. So, how many of you remember Chevy Nova? This is a more recent car. Does anyone know what non va means in Spanish, or frankly, even in Italian? It means it doesn't go. So no one wants to get a car that doesn't go. Chevy Nova. It's like, OK. Again, sales didn't do well. And then the example I have here. So Irish Mist, great drink, did very well in Ireland. Introduced it to Germany. But to any of you that understand German, BS means manure. Or mist means BS or manure in German. So it turns out no one wanted to buy Irish BS in Germany. And a drink that did very well in Ireland, all of a sudden didn't do so well in Germany. And why? Because it didn't translate so well. And do as the Romans do. If you're going to a country to do business, try to follow the traditional practices of doing business in that country so that it is easier for them to absorb what you're telling them because they're getting in a format of what they're used to. All right. Another opportunity, third quiz and final quiz for today, for you to get Starbucks cards. This was President Ahmadinejad when talking about nuclear power in Iran. And it was, what he actually said was Iran has the right to nuclear energy. However, it was mistranslated as saying what? A, Iran needs nuclear energy to survive. B, Iran has the right to nuclear power. C, Iran has the right to build nuclear weapons. And D, Iran can find alternatives to nuclear energy. How many of you think it's A? B? C? D? Final answer? C. Iran has the right to build nuclear weapons. All right, so to all of you that don't have Starbucks cards, keep your hands up, and Jane, I will give you some Starbucks cards. So, whether the interpreter made that mistake on purpose or not, Ahmadinejad certainly got in a lot of trouble for it. I mean, it made it all over the news, and there was a lot that went into it that he kept hearing about it for a long time. So interpretation mistakes can cause a lot of trouble. This was the first part that we talked a bit to date, or up until this point, was very much what are some of the objective things that how to do translation properly, how to manage it properly. And now, what does Alexa do to basically address some of these things in this context? It's all about addressing your setting up the organization as an extension of your team. So a lot of you are used to having internal translation departments or may have organizations you've worked on, and that makes life a lot easier because they really get to know you as an organization. So part of the point behind it is create a team, consistent team, same people, although they may not be based out of your offices, to really address it like an extension of your team. Scalability, having much bigger translation teams than what your internal departments would do, so that they can scale up and down as needed to address translation needs in a faster period of time or larger volume of documents. Dedicated project managers, really, they get to know you very intimately, get to know the preference of even individuals within your organization. Create and maintain this translation memories for you, and essentially these glossaries that are specific to you as a client, and really make sure that these are kept up to date and are consistently refined with the latest work you're doing. And subject area specialist teams. So teams that really understand everything you need, and that depending on what your organization needs, there may be multiple teams to address the various levels. 5 stages in translation to make sure the translation is done accurately. And this is how we do it. My recommendation is this is how any translation should be done as well. And this is the words of advice to leave with you. And basically, you want to clarify to the project manager from the get-go what is the timeline, what needs to be done, scope of what is to be designed for, send it through, and then the project manager will make sure the translator, reviser, everyone involved in the team is reflecting the competence required for your translation. Then the translators get started. The primary one does all the research, reflects the translation memory and terminology database. It says, what's been done for this client? Are there any terms that correspond to previous work done? Let's keep this consistent. Then it goes to the reviser, stage 3. The reviser is now reviewing everything the translator did. Is not as focused on the research that the primary translator did, but they're focused on the refinement of the document, making sure that anything from grammar to sentence structure to flow of the document. Then sending it back to the original translator, because they were the ones that did the research. If there is any room for discussion with each other, it happens at that stage before it goes to the client. That part is important because this is now something that is maintaining the integrity of your documents. The last step sends it to the project manager. Project manager does a final review before getting it back to you. You get a document at that point that you shouldn't have to do anything else to it. And that's the point of acting like a team that is well-refined and that acts like your in-house team without you having to review it internally. Because you're not always going to have the resources or the time to have it reviewed internally. Some of the documents that we deal with over time and that many of you will deal with as issuers or working in your various capacities. And some of the services provided, anything from translation, transcription of documents, as well as the cultural consulting, which is the piece I didn't get a chance to address. But to the last slide when we were talking about being culturally sensitive, what we'll do is actually have some cultural consultants going in and depending on what country you're dealing with, they'll provide you perspective, overall cultural sensitivity, as well as some perspective on that particular country. And my contact information. I really hope that any of you that have questions will feel free to reach out, whether now or later with anything you may have. I'm happy to address it in the future. We'll make sure to send you this electronically as well, so you have an electronic version of this presentation. But we're not out of Starbucks cards yet. So if any of you have any questions, things that we didn't get a chance to address, and I promise you, you'll not get a bill. This is not like dealing with lawyers. You're not going to get a bill at the end of the presentation. So free advice right now. If anyone else have any questions, please let me know, whether in person here or via the colleagues that are via webcast. I think I've still kept them awake this whole time. So thank you to all of them for attending. So if no other questions, thank you for coming today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. And please do not ever hesitate to contact me personally with any questions you may have.